Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my November wrap-up. November was a improved reading month for me. Although I didn't read everything that I wanted to, I did read somewhat more slower and accomplished more than I thought would be possible for the month. I am still somewhat disappointed not to have finished certain books that I had planned to read, and there are definitely still books that I've got that are being pushed back each month, which tends to happen with me. I just don't tend to talk about them in these parts. Despite having a good reading month though, there are some books that I can't be talking about. Firstly, last month I was beta reading 2 books for friends of mine. One you'll know from BookTube and one is a writerly acquaintance who I've worked with for nearly 10 years now. And yeah, it was great to read their works and offer feedback. And it's one of those moments when, as a writer, I feel somewhat proud and grateful that people are coming to me and thinking that I know enough that I could help them in any sort of way. And 2, it's great to get this sense of pride of knowing people who are so skillful at their craft, or in one case, there are great realms of potential at some points, but there is such a dearth of brilliance within their prose that you just feel happy. I feel happy to know those people. Another 2 books that I won't be talking about here because I will be doing a dual review, not this Saturday but the following Saturday, are Mancunian Ways, which is edited by Isabelle, Kenyon and features some of my favourite northern poets, and it's all about being a celebration of Manchester, and The Sound of the Revolution by Grae J. Wall, which is beat poems and anxious gasps. Both of these are published by Fly on the Wall Press, and I was sent them both for free in exchange for a review. So you've got that to look forward to. Right, let's move on to the books I can actually talk about properly. Firstly, we have My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This book has been so popular that I really believed this was going to be a favourite horror book that really just had this pastiche of 1980s horror and really had me feeling all of the nostalgia for the 80s. Again, I wasn't born in the 80s, but when you're a 90s child born in the early 90s, you're raised on the films of the 80s, and you have parents who call them classics. Well, I have one parent who was calling stuff from the 80s stuff that she'd watched as a teenager, and then I had another parent who was already a parent in the 80s, and most of his classic films are in the 60s and 70s, and we don't talk about the toxic masculinity of some of my father's favourite films, although we do like to tear them apart in front of him and make him go to bed. Anyway, My Best Friend's Exorcism unfortunately disappointed me. So this book follows a character whose name I have forgotten, but let's just look at the back. This follows Abby and Gretchen, and I believe that Gretchen ends up possessed. I can understand where the 80s nostalgia comes from, and this is definitely a nostalgia feast. It felt like a celebration of the 80s. It felt like the celebration of 80s horror, but at the same time, I just didn't end up feeling anything towards it because it is so similar to stuff we've seen so many years ago. As a reader, I felt like it was very easy to figure out where the story was going to go, what beats the story would hit. And sometimes I don't mind that. As I've mentioned before, there are books that do hit every single beat. Indeed, there is one book in this wrap-up that I felt more favourably towards, even though it was a bit predictable, but there was just something missing from this book for me, and I don't know what it was. It's a book that I liked, and it's a book that I read quickly, but the characters weren't that memorable. I suppose that this is another book where the only thing I was looking for was this sense of terror, and then I realised I wasn't going to get this. It was going to be more light-hearted and more focused perhaps on the teen drama as opposed to the actual horror genre. Sure, there are some horrific aspects to this story, and they were done very well. There was this definite sense of unease from the fact that showing us the school at the time and the way the teachers treated the students there and the behaviour of a certain class, and there is a class struggle within this story that I appreciated seeing that is present in a lot of 80s films. Seeing that did emphasise a lot of the changes that have taken place in the last 30 to 40 years, so I appreciated seeing them. Therefore, this book ends up being somewhat difficult for me because there is so much in here that's good, and I think that I could easily recommend this book to someone who's looking for 80s nostalgia or who's a fan of those films from the 80s. But again, it's one of those things where I think I would prefer to watch one of the films, and I would get more out of watching the film than I would reading the book. Again, it's got an excellent cover, and I think that that's why it became a cover buy for me. I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to read it. Dane's told me to lower my expectations when it comes to the horror genre. And maybe that's one of the problems that I had, because we've got a classic Exorcism story here that I think that a lot of people would like. And I did like it, I just didn't become overtly enthusiastic about the book. It just felt like it middled along and then fizzled out, and there was an epilogue here that was completely unnecessary. The story ended, and then the author decided to tell us everything that had happened after the story ended. I enjoyed the book, but that still added more to this sense of, oh, it's not the best. It's not the worst, but it's not the best. It's a bit like Detox in All Stars 2. Then I read Confessions of a Bookseller by Shaun Bythell, or Bythell, I never figured out how to say that. And this is the guy who's at the Wigtown bookshop. Basically, I read the Diary of a Bookseller a few years ago. I received this for Christmas last year, and I think it's one of 3 books that I hadn't read. So I have now read it, and I liked it. This is not a book that... I was reading this slowly. I was in a small bit of a reading slump. I was feeling a bit sad for reasons that I don't know, and it was nice to have an easy book that I didn't have to think too heavily about. I liked it. I'm keeping it to reread for when I'm in one of those moods where I just need something easy to read that doesn't take a lot of focus. When I read this book, it makes me wish that I had my own bookshop, which is always fun. But some of the things that he experiences as a second-hand bookseller, I could empathise with as someone who works in a charity shop, because he gets asked the same sort of things we get asked at a charity shop, except the difference is he's actually paying for his stock. So it surprises me when customers come along and they think, oh, but you don't really need to make a profit, do you? I feel like the internet and internet shopping has a lot to answer for when it comes to smaller second-hand sellers trying to make a living, because people always want something for nothing, and this book highlighted that, and some of his interactions with customers thrilled me. I don't know why I was feeling reflective about work and not hating the experience, but Confessions of a Bookseller helped with that. Next, I read Your Voice Crosses the Ocean, a foil Young Poets of the Year anthology, and this was released by the Poetry Society. I'm not sure of the ages of the poets in here. I was impressed with some of them. I wasn't so much impressed with others. However, that's the nature of any anthology. Some of the pieces in here, I could not believe they'd been written by young people, which is a bad thing on my part, but I mean that they felt more experienced, they felt at the top of their craft. And if we're talking about the potential I've seen in my friends in their writing earlier this year, I feel like the potential of some of the writers in here, if this is what they're writing at this age, I can only imagine what their writing will look like in a few years' time, with some more craft and some more honing that's necessary for every writer. But I'll just say well done to the poets who made it into this collection and for the work that they're putting out into the world. Now we move on to Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So Piranesi lives in a labyrinth. There is only one other person who lives in this labyrinth. Now, we're somewhere where the labyrinth floods often, and Piranesi has to get to certain heights. His shoes have worn out, and he's only ever visited by one person who he calls the Other. He sees the Other as a friend. The reader, however, understands from the off that the Other might be somewhat more malevolent than Piranesi realises. This is a book that is like a thriller that goes in reverse. Once I reached the midpoint of this story and there were certain revelations, which are slowly eked out throughout the prose, the biggest revelation comes towards the end, where we're finding out who everybody is and how they came to be towards this labyrinth. You never really understand what the labyrinth is, what's going on, and that's part of the book's charm. It leaves a lot to the reader to figure things out for themselves. It was a perfect book for autumnal winter times because it's a nice book to just sit down and read, one for Susanna Clarke's prose, but also for the fact that I really love a mystery in autumn, and having a mystery that was blended with fantasy in such a fashion was just great. Also, I think that telling the story from Piranesi's point of view, who we don't really know who he is, we can make guesses based on what we're being told, and you can make guesses about bones that he's categorized, and he's making these diaries, and we get sections of the diaries throughout, but they don't really make sense. And then you get this sense that it links up to the modern day as well. As I say, the book begins in the what would normally, I think, be almost like the midpoint of a thriller. And here, I can't make a certain point I want to make because that would be a spoiler of the entirety of the book. But for me, this entire book had a sense of unease throughout. Not just because Piranesi is in this strange labyrinth that he's not even managed to traverse the entirety of yet, but because somebody else arrives in the labyrinth and we're not sure whether they are a villain or a friend. I recognise the Other as a villain straight away just because of their behaviour, but then they're the only person that Piranesi has to count on. You would get glimpses of stuff happening in other places and wonder just where these other places were. I'm saying it in such a way because I don't want to spoil the book or have any possibility of spoiling what ended up being quite a magical read that I stayed up into the middle of the night reading, as I did with a few of these books, because my insomnia has been back in full force, and reading an entire book in the middle of the night seems to be the new thing for Charlie. Piranesi is a magical mystery ride that is told with prose that is somewhat elegant and is also thrilling and tense and, as I usually say, brilliant. Then I listened to the audiobook of The Last Continent by Terry Pratchett. The Last Continent is the first time I have read a Rincewind book and I have enjoyed it. This sees the wizards send Rincewind to this other continent. I can't exactly remember why, but time is moving differently there. I think it's this riff on the fact that in Australia they're so far ahead, and then we've got stuff moving back in time. There's a lot about displaced time in this story. Again, it's comedic. It riffs on a lot of stuff to do with Australians, and I couldn't tell whether it was offensive or humorous at first. The time stuff became a bit confusing, but that added to the humour. And yeah, as with most of the Terry Pratchetts now, that he properly seems to be into it. The early ones I could listen to, and I was enjoying them as a bit of easy listening, but this time around I want to keep listening to them because I find them so humorous. The narrator, Nigel Planer, is doing a great job, and I know he changes to I know the narrator changes to Stephen Briggs in a few books, and we'll see how I feel when the narrator changes, but Nigel Planer has some great comedic timing that lends itself well to narration. Then we are moving on to D by Michel Faber. I read this book based on the video that Jen Campbell did with the author. Similarly, I read the book of Strange New Things by Michel Faber based on Jen Campbell's recommendation, and I'm beginning to think that Michel Faber might not be the author for me. D is a story based on a classic tale that I can't remember, but basically the letter D has disappeared from the alphabet, which is important considering it is the main character it's the first letter of Dikelo's name. She is somewhat outcast at school based on the fact that she's a black youngster from a terror-ridden country that nobody has ever heard of. One of her favourite teachers ends up dying, and upon his funeral, Dikelo makes some discoveries. She's wondering why the letter D has disappeared from the alphabet. She seems to be getting into a lot of trouble for this. And then we have this almost portal fantasy where Dikelo ends up sent into another world in search of the letter D. Here is where the Dickens influence is, because I should have mentioned that first. Michel Faber apparently released this book to coincide with 150 years of Charles Dickens' birth or death. I don't know. I'm not a historian. Either way, the book is based on that, so you see a lot of links to Dickens' work in the names of characters and certain ways that they operate. And as someone who's read a bit of Dickens, it was nice to see that in here and to be able to make those connections with books and think about how the characters in here relate and their names relate to the Dickens characters, and the way the author has created people that are based on certain character tropes from Dickens' work. However, if we look at this story as middle grade fiction, which it reads like really with the age of the character and the way the story is told, then we have a very stereotypical story that is somewhat like Narnia. Again, not a problem. And it's a readable book. It's a beautifully bound book. I am not sure why Dikelo needed to be the main character in the end, simply because whilst there are thrilling moments with Bleak House, which is a place that closes up, and when they enter into Bleak House, doors will disappear and they will find themselves in another, similar to Piranesi, endless labyrinth of rooms with no escape. And this was mildly terrifying because it was reminiscent of nightmares and gave this sense of claustrophobia. And there were moments like that throughout the prose and scattered here and there to emphasise what a dark world, this other world that Dikelo has wandered into, were. Or are. Is. It's a problem when you start a sentence, you can't remember where it's going to end. But the climax of this novel comes at a strange point, because what Dikelo does to kind of lead into the climax happens so early that you have Dikelo do something, then you have like a point of no return type deal that you would usually get in a story, and then the way the actual climactic point of the novel is written, it feels as though Dikelo then didn't really do anything to help the narrative, and I don't know how I felt about that. I liked the manner in which Michel Faber's written. I know that he is able to take on a lot of different narratorial voices that really do help to bring a story to life, and he did that here, and it was very reminiscent of classic children's authors. Indeed, it had touches of Charles Dickens in there, which I appreciated. Appreciated some of the tales that were being told, and I liked the dark places that this story went to actually show what a tyrant is and the way they will work to have utter control over a world. I like the revelation as to why the letter D was being removed from the alphabet. I like the idea that letters, more than words, had power, and that was a great thing. So there are certainly aspects of this book that I appreciated, and I will probably keep the book on my shelves to reread and see how I think upon a reread. But currently, I feel as though the book needed a bit more work and a bit more clarity, and this is another book where the ending just didn't match up to the promises that the writing had made earlier on. Next, I read The Death of Vivek OJ by Akwaeke Emezi. I read this for Cozy Reading Night, read it in one sitting, And I'm still not sure how I feel about this book either. This book begins with the death of Vivek OJ and then goes into the past to talk about their life, as well as sticking in the present to talk about the after effects of their death. This book, as with others by Akwaeke Emezi, talks about gender and sexuality, and indeed here is talking about Nigeria's perception of gender and sexuality and the difference between the older and the younger generations. I would say that this book is Emezi's most accomplished work. It still has hints of the tale we saw with Freshwater, with different narrators coming together to tell the story. And this time, it's somewhat similar in the fact that it's different people talking about a person and their body without properly knowing their soul. Whereas with Freshwater, it was a lot of spirits inhabiting one body, talking about that body, talking about their soul and the changes there. It could be the sister to Freshwater in theme. In style, it's different. Here I have a book that's left me feeling somewhat strange because I don't know the best way to express my thoughts. I felt that the story needed to be longer to properly explore all of the ideas that the author presented. At the same time, however, I appreciated the author's brevity and concision in telling the story because it leaves the reader to think and formulate their own opinions of characters and stories. And in not exploring the ideas in such a way that they are fully realised and the story has every single loose end wrapped up, it leaves a lot to linger in the reader's imagination and they're left to wonder what would have happened, what happened here, what happened there. What I really wanted more than anything was the opportunity to see Vivek living their best life with the person that they loved. And we didn't get that, but at the same time, that adds to this sense of grief because Vivek's life is ultimately cut short, and from the beginning, we know what their conclusion will be. There were a few parts towards the end I felt were a bit muddy, and I'm not sure how I feel about them, but then at the same time, it's caused me to question myself based on these things that happened, and whether I'm not bringing too many ideas of how a person ought to behave based on a very westernized view of that and the way that we're taught that people ought to behave in grief. Then I'm left thinking, actually, it is a book to go back and reread, and it's a book that, if it's leaving me thinking more, then no matter the length, it's probably a bit more fantastic than I thought. If the book is lingering and I'm able to think about the story and my own opinions, then that's worth its weight in gold then. It's giving me more interaction with the book even after I finished reading it. So, not a review again, just thoughts on it. Currently, the way that I'd recommend these books is in the reverse of how they were published, because the author has improved upon each book with each book, whilst also exploring similar themes. I am extremely excited to see how their career is going to flourish. And then I read Meat by Dane Cobain. I was at the page 100 mark last Tuesday. I took the book downstairs and I read the entirety of it in a few hours after I'd woken up early. So I spent my morning reading Meat, which basically Dane has written that this book sees Tom Copeland, a disgraced veterinarian, begin working for a huge factory farm, a corporation that has hundreds of thousands of animals and meat products. It's a discussion, a horror novel about the effects of Brexit on farming practices in the UK. When I went in, I thought that this was like a vegan manifesto meets a horror novel. Also, as we know, as I keep saying, I'm looking to be terrified. I'm looking to be grossed out. And there was one scene here that was almost gory enough to make me feel as though how I felt when I read a certain scene, the peach scene in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. But ultimately, this book wasn't the gore fest I expected, yet I was impressed. I think that this is Dane's best novel. I say it has touches of Stephen King in how broad the cast is and how every single cast member has something to add to the story. There was a bit in the middle where I felt like there may be too many characters and a lot of them were getting killed off really quickly, and I thought, yeah, well, this could have all been done in one blow. We could have had a flaming cow stampede and just trampled half the cast and then stuck to the main cast members to save us some time here. But what Dane has done is we have the first 100 pages or so, the first part, which leads us into this outbreak of a disease, which is a bit of a pandemic and isn't something I necessarily wanted to be reading during these times, but we're supportive of our friends, so I did. Like I say, I'm impressed. This book is brilliant, and Dane's skill as a writer is really showing here. As I say, that there are moments where I thought it was a bit muddy, yet it's Dane's longest work. And if we're looking at some classic horror fiction, there are these large casts. It does lend to sometimes figuring out who's going to die based on who is most important to the story. But the way this book ends was a brilliant thing, because we've seen Tom Copeland throughout the entirety of this book. And there are parts where he's disappeared from the narrative for a very long time, and you're wondering just what he's up to. The final scene in this novel felt fitting. It really worked for the story that Dane was telling, and for what I believe was the intent behind the book. I say it was difficult for me to read about in the way the corporation was described, because I think when we think factory farmers, we think that they sometimes operate in the way that normal farmers operate. And knowing the farming community for so many years around me, and knowing they don't operate like this, but the idea that they could, was probably the most terrifying thing about this book. There is a level of tension to the prose there, as there should be with a horror novel. There are links to many classic horror novels, such as when you've got like an abandoned hospital here, you've got an abandoned factory farm that's being overrun by the animals. You have a post-apocalyptic world that's really at some points, and you have that tale there. And it's great to see how Dane has clearly read a lot from the horror genre, and he's brought his favourite bits in order to tell this tale. At some points, I did feel as though characters were being used more as tools than as characters, but sometimes that has to happen in order to be able to tell the story that you want to tell. And I understand that. And honestly, if you want to start preparing your Halloween TBRs for next year, then I say definitely go for this. But if you want a dark, grim read that isn't going to let up in 450 pages, then this will also be a good book for you to read. Dane has done a fantastic job. I'm impressed. And I'm still unhappy that I didn't end up terrified, but there you go. Finally, I read Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce. This story follows Miss Benson, who, upon something happening in her workplace, recognises that she doesn't want to be there anymore and is going to embark upon a voyage to discover a beetle in New Caledonia that she has wanted to find since she was a young girl. On her way, she ends up gaining an assistant in the form of Edith Pretty, who might be hiding a few skeletons in the closet. This leads us into a voyage, a story that is a story of friendship at its core. For the most part, I adored this book. I ended up reading the majority of it in one sitting in bed the other night. Then the ending came around. Now, firstly, I will say with Rachel Joyce's books, you tend to know what you're going to get. She wrote for the radio. She is a fantastic storyteller. In contrast to My Best Friend's Exorcism, this is a book that hits every single story beat. As a reader, you know which beats it's going to hit because it feels very much like a BBC original film. But as a reader, you're also able to accept this because the story is rather fantastic and the storytelling skill there is second to none. I love reading Rachel Joyce's books simply for the prose. It is calm and there's tension beneath it and there is darkness there. And there are these little asides that would remind me of radio plays at times to give the audience more context as to the story and what was going on in the outside world as opposed to the insular world that Miss Benson and Edith Pretty are living in. With the story, the characters are some of Rachel Joyce's strongest. She has this way of writing characters that are lonely and estranged from the world. We saw it with Harold Fry, who, due to something that happens that is only hinted at throughout the entire novel, he is estranged from his wife, even though they're living in the same house. We see it with Queenie Hennessy, the protagonist in the music shop, whose name I forget, was an outcast as well. And here we have Miss Benson. And again, we have Edith Pretty, a character, her name's not Edith, Enid Pretty, who is bringing Miss Benson out of herself. What I'm about to say will be somewhat controversial and offensive, and I just have to use it to explain the trope that's happening here. And it's something that was mentioned when I was at uni of the prude and the tart. So here we have a woman who is incredibly stuffy and still living a somewhat secluded life, very Victorian values, despite the fact the book is set in the 1950s. And then you have Enid, who has lived through the war as a youngster and come out of the other side wanting to be an independent woman, who dyes her hair, who wears revealing clothes, and who gets by in overtly sexualizing herself, knowing that that's a way to get men on side. But that is never denigrated, really. It is somewhat celebrated that Enid knows what she's doing. She's taken charge in her life. I just want to say that. Seeing that classic story presented here and using Enid to bring Miss Benson out of herself was a fantastic move on the author's part, and I loved seeing their relationship together. I loved the tension that arose from this guy who Miss Benson had interviewed and how he'd got a different idea of what was going on. However, the issue for me arrives within the final 50 pages. Now, even though this story is hitting every beat it ought to hit, it seems to hit them at strange points and occasions. We have a build-up, and then the letdown seems to happen, and then we get a climactic scene. This climactic scene, I'm still not sure how I feel about it. Well, I know how I feel about it, actually. There's no point saying I'm not sure how I feel about it, because as a reader and an observer, I hate it. It upsets me greatly. But as a writer and as someone who has been consuming fiction and watching television for years, I knew that this is the outcome that would happen. I knew this was the outcome that would happen because of certain things that had been revealed throughout the story, and I knew that they would end in no other way, despite me wishing that they would, and despite me wishing that we could just have a happy ending, and I just knew that that wouldn't be the case. There was a certain part of the climax and the way the story went that I did disagree with a bit, and I'm not quite sure what the author was trying to say. But ultimately, as a book to revisit and a reliable read, then I would definitely go back to this book, as I would with any of other Rachel Joyce's books, because I know she's a great storyteller, and I know that as a reader I can just relax and allow her to tell the story. Definitely a great book with only a few minor flaws that slightly dampened my experience whilst reading this one. But as with all Rachel Joyce's books, fantastic characters, fantastic story, and yeah, it was great to see a woman in her 50s shown in fiction as taking charge of her life and emphasising that life doesn't end at a certain age and you can still make achievements and accomplishments, and the revelations she had were certainly some brilliant ones. I keep forgetting that this wasn't Enid's story, it was Miss Benson's story, and so I should have known all along really how things would turn out. Them's the books. If you have read any of them and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. If you want to go into more depth in your comments, somewhat spoilery, if you want that proper discussion, then I am available on a variety of social media platforms that are always linked in the description. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.